Well, here we are at hurdle 3. Now, if you've seen the first 2, then we should now be in a position where we've looked at the medical model and how it has us thinking about ourselves and the way to think about ourselves. We've got over that hurdle and we've now looked closer at the idea of the medical model, man's wisdom, versus the biblical model. And so we should now have more of a sense of how we should think about ourselves. The idea that we are God's masterpiece. We're not starting from that position of what's wrong with me. So here we are at hurdle 3, which is the idea of going from conflict to harmony. Now I'm trying to keep these hurdles in some kind of sensible order. In other words, it's now that we've got here that we can start to look at, well, what's the idea here? How do we now make progress with this knowledge? Well, we start to aim for a harmonized self rather than a conflicted self. And so let me give you the evidence for that, because everything should come from the Word of God, right? Everything that we know and everything that we teach, we should find in the Word. So I want to take you to John 17 and verse 21. And what that says is very instructive. Now, it's not the only place in the Bible that says it. There are other examples, but this is the best one. I absolutely love John 17. It's one of my favorite chapters. And basically, it's split into 3 parts, just to set the context here, which I think needs to be done. The first section, Jesus prays for himself. And in the second section, Jesus prays for his disciples. But in the third section, he prays for you and for me. Now, that's quite mind-blowing in itself, right? But I'll show you how to understand that that's true, okay? And we also need to set the context, because John 17 is written about a time between the Last Supper and Jesus' being taken for crucifixion. So it's an incredibly tense and important time. And really, well, let me read it first and then I'll ask you a question. John 17:21, he says, in fact, I'm going to start from verse 20. My prayer is not for them alone. He's talking about the disciples there. I pray also for those who will believe in me through the message. Now that's you and me, by the way. That they, all of them may be one, Father. That all of them may be one. Now I'm reading from the NIV here, but you'll see other versions will say that they should all be in unity. Now I'm assured by Greek scholars, which I'm not, that the word that is here translated as unity, you can also get to the word harmony. So that's the way sort of to think of it, as unity and harmony. And a lot of you have read that, a lot of you have heard sermons on it actually, and have maybe just moved on thinking that, well, yeah, he's saying that we should all love each other and be in unity and harmony together as his church. Now, this is very important, of course, and it says elsewhere in the Bible that you'll know, people will know you're my followers because you love each other. So that's very important, but that's not what he's talking about here. How do I know? Well, let's look at what he says immediately following. He says, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So that is, when he says, as you are in me, he's talking to the Father. And he's saying, the Father, just as you, Father, are in me, I shall be in them, and they shall be in us. In other words, this is a spiritual thing. He's not talking about a practical thing. You can't be inside something that's inside you. That practically, that doesn't make any sense. But spiritually, it does. And so that is my evidence for saying he's actually talking about inner harmony, inner unity, not externally. That's important. That's elsewhere in the Bible. But here it is inner harmony. And that's why we start to look at the idea of a conflicted self and the fact that Jesus is moving us to a harmonized self. So just look at that context for a minute and ask yourself this. If you only had one chance to pray for somebody. You had one prayer. What would you say? What would you pray for? Think about that for a minute, right? I don't know what the answer is to that. Everybody probably would be different. But I do know this. I think it's fair to say it would be the most important prayer you could think of, right? Now, Jesus is just about to be taken away to be crucified. So ask yourself this. What is the most important thing that Jesus can think of to pray for? You might say, well, does he pray that we should have a mega church, a massive church? No. Does he pray that we should be studying the Word of God all day long, every day? No, that's not it. Does he pray that we should be going out every hour that he sends to evangelize and tell people about him and show him? No. He prays for inner unity. Now, just take that on board for a minute, because he's praying for somebody, in our case, who's not even going to be born for 2,000 years, but that's his concern. Just take that on board now. The most important thing that Jesus says you can do to make progress, to develop yourself spiritually, to go from milk to meat, to be transformed, all of that stuff is to be in harmony with yourself. That is mind-blowing, right? Now, let me give you another example here. It's an important one because, we should be able to back this up biblically. And I'm reading here from the book of Mark. It's chapter 3, it's verse 24. You'll probably know it because here Jesus is once again being accused by the religious leaders to say, you've got demons and basically he argues against them this way. He says, so Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. Wow. He's saying if you're in a conflicted position, you can't stand. What does he go on to say? He says, if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. You're a house, by the way. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. Wow. Now, in other versions, again, you will read where it says, Satan was divided against himself and he fell. So again, really clear evidence that Jesus is talking about inner harmony, right? So, when we think about the first two hurdles and the idea of where does the medical model, where does man's wisdom place as well? If the Bible is true, if the Bible is correct, then anything from this world is opposed to God's world. It is opposed to the kingdom of heaven. So if the medical model, if man's wisdom places us in a conflicted position, and Jesus is saying, well, the most important thing is you should be harmonized, well, then it's not surprising to us, is it? It should not surprise us that the man's wisdom is saying what's wrong with you. Let's start there. Okay? So then any time you're saying to yourself, oh, I should be more like this, and I wish I was more like that, and I should be stronger, I should be faster, I should be cleverer, I should be nicer, I should be wiser, all of that stuff is you conflicted. That's what it means. So what do we do about that? How would we take that knowledge and that understanding and go into action? What method? What is the way of doing it, right? That's what our next question should be. Well, there's a very clear answer to that, and it is as simple as it is powerful and effective. It is to do what Jesus did. That's what we're going to do. We're going to do what Jesus did. Basically, he left us a model. He left us a method, which I always say, it's been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years, right? And it's called discipling. Now, how do we start to understand this idea? Well, I want you to look at Romans 1, verse 20, which basically says, since time began, anyone who looks at God's design can see God. He's basically saying, if you look out of any window, you can see God's incredible creativity and design. And so man has no excuse, right? And what I take from that is that we can learn and we can grow, not just by using God's word, which is complete and which is without error, but we can also look at God's design. Even the Bible itself talks about, look at the ant, and Jesus says, look at the lily, and, there's the birds of the earth, and there's things like seasons, this is God's design. And so when we take his design, we can learn from that and we can use that, right? So part of God's design was that Jesus was sent to us to disciple people, right? And how important was this? Incredibly important, because we're all Christians today because of what they did. So when you look at discipling, right, as a method, as a process, the first thing I want you to do is to understand what that is. So let's look at what that is. If you boil that, as the Americans say, right down to the gravy, right? What really was it? Well, I would say it was to get them to trust him. That was the actual job. And it took 3.5 years, and it took crucifixion, it took rising again. It took all sorts of things before they truly, truly believed and trusted him. And they lost all fear of death, and they were able to fulfill their ministry. So what you've got then is a method. Now, what you can do with that is quite extraordinary, see, because the Bible is saying that you have within you both the spirit and the flesh, right? The Bible has been clear about that for 2,000 years. But neuroscience, if I can just flip across to some neuroscience now, neuroscience has more recently, in the last sort of 20 years, has started to prove, it's evidence-based now, that you are complex, that you are not just one thing, right? Which of course man's wisdom has you thinking. You see, if you're one thing, then it starts to make sense that you're conflicted and crazy and this and that, right? Because you're sometimes up, you're sometimes down, you're sometimes honest, you sometimes tell lies, you do things you don't want to do, right? And medical stuff makes sense, right? But once you understand that you're complex, once you get that you are multifaceted, and this is how you've been designed, then it no longer is a mental illness. It's no longer a pathological thing. It is actually something to work with. Now, this is already causing some of you to wonder about this. Hang on, work with our evil nature and all that? No, I understand, right? But let's look at what Jesus did, because that's the most important lesson, always. If you look in Matthew, chapter 7, verse 11, right, you will see that following the Beatitudes in chapter 5, Jesus is teaching the disciples. Now, I know a large crowd did gather, and that leads to the impression with some people that he was teaching the crowd, but he was actually teaching the disciples. Check it out for yourself, right? And in verse 11 of chapter 7, he calls the disciples evil to their face. Look it up for yourself. He says, if you then who are evil. Now, if we're following this teaching, which, by the way, it's got into the church, watch out for it in sermons and stuff, right? If you've fallen for this idea that all you're supposed to do is fight evil because you're conflicted and especially if you've heard teaching, from, you'll recognize these people because they really talk as if they know everything, which nobody does, right? And they will offer you this sort of thing. They'll say, you've said a prayer, so now you're not a sinner anymore, and you don't sin now, right? This is nonsense, okay? As long as you are living, believe me, as long as you are a breathing, living, physical human being, you will have a sinful nature within you. And the Bible's very clear about it. It says, if you say you're not a sinner, you call God a liar. You make God out to be a liar. So don't buy any of that, right? Understand that not only do you have a sinful nature that is opposed to God, but that you're supposed to work with it. Absolutely. And how do we know? Because that's what Jesus did. If he called the disciples evil, why didn't he just fight them and get rid of them? Why is he bothering with us? Why did he come to the earth? Right? Well, because we are worth working with. Right? And his job was to get this ragtag and bobtail bunch of people to trust him completely. And that is your job too. You see, the real way that your inner parts or your flesh or your brain, depending on which approach you're taking, right? If it's the Bible, it'll be called your flesh. If it's neuroscience, it'll be called your brain, and so on. If you are working with that part of you and you're considering it worth working with, then I want you to think of yourself as doing the same thing that Jesus did. Think about working with your parts and getting them to trust you. Right? Now, let me jump across to a therapy perspective for a second. As a psychotherapist, what am I doing? I'm asking people to consider their authentic state. What therapy would call your authentic state? What in biblical terms we would call your Christ consciousness or your Christ mindedness. Now, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to encourage people. I'm trying to inspire people. And I'm trying to tell them this. If you are in your authentic state, then you will always make the right decision. Always. Right? No inconsistency. This is fascinating to me, right? When you start from a position that says, I'm God's masterpiece, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, then why would you make bad decisions? Why would you do something you don't want to do? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? But once you understand that it's not just you as an authentic state, it's also your brain, your parts, your flesh, they sometimes take over. Now it makes perfect sense. And now suddenly we can read Romans 7 and verse 20 and so on and say, well, if I do what I don't want to do, that's not me that's doing it. It's something or somebody else. Well, that's your parts. That's your inner disciples, right? So your job is, your new perspective is, first of all, getting over the hurdle that you're not supposed to be conflicted, you're supposed to be harmonized. How do you do that? You accept that you are multifaceted and complex, right? And you understand that you, just as in Peter in Matthew 16, you are indistinguishable from God when you're in your authentic state. That's what Jesus said. These words didn't come from you, Peter, they came from my Father. He's saying, at this moment, you're indistinguishable from God. But what did he say a few minutes later? Get behind me, Satan, right? Because he steps straight back into the things of man, right? His flesh took over. Okay, so what do we do with this? Well, I don't want to leave you here at this point. We are going to go over 4 more hurdles, but I want to give you just a little hint and a little tip. What do I do about this? If this is true, I don't want to just feel you leave me in this strange place where I don't know if it's me or not, right? Well, the first thing to understand is this. It's not pathological. That is the thing I want you to get hold of. You are not mentally ill if you have these voices and parts. You are normal. Okay, that's the first thing. And I also want to give you what neuroscience has proven and shown to be encapsulating your authentic state. Okay, and you can check this out. I'll leave a link in the notes so you can look at this further and the incredible things that studying the brain more closely has shown us. It's shown the Bible to be true, basically. Okay, so I want you to listen to these 8 words. And these 8 words generally, what we call encapsulate your authentic state, or what the Bible would call your Christ-mindedness. Okay, so here they are. Calm, clear, creative, curious, courageous, confident, connected, and compassionate. Now, if you are in your authentic state, you will feel that you have those resources. You will feel connected to those things. If you don't feel those things, if you start to feel them drop out, if curiosity becomes a bit dogmatic and certain, or if, calmness turns to a bit of panic, or if confidence, I feel a bit unconfident. If you feel those changes, those physiological changes, then the first thing I would say is this: you are not in your Christ-mindedness at that point, okay? It's not a crime. It's simply a thing to understand. I just want you to raise awareness around it, all right? Secondly, if you can do this, all right, try to not make any big decisions in that state, okay? If you can't identify with those 8 resources, if you don't feel calm, if you don't feel creative, if you don't feel confident and courageous and connected and compassionate, look out for any of those things dropping out. If you feel all of those things, make the decision, because that decision will be right every time. Now, that's a confident and bold thing to say, I know, but I want you to check it out in the Bible. Have a look in Luke 15 at the prodigal son. This is the best story to read from Jesus' own lips. Okay, he tells a parable. In other words, there wasn't any really a man and 2 sons. He's giving us a story, okay? But I want you to check out everything from verse 17 onwards. The younger son's decisions were perfect. Everything he does, everything he says, everything he thinks and feels. Okay? Why is that? Well, it's because he's in his authentic state. Everything he does prior to verse 17 is a disaster. Why? Because he's not in his authentic state. So that's the best story, I think, to understand this idea, this multifaceted idea. So raise awareness around where you are conflicted. And what we mean by conflicted is this: your brain takes over, right? It's where the disciples start to run the show instead of Jesus, okay? You are Jesus to your disciples, right? So study this in the Word, because, honestly, I would really recommend you do a study on this. How did Jesus disciple the 12, right? Because when you look at examples of where the disciples took over, it's a disaster, right? Look at things like, when they said, should we call fire down, Lord, on this village, right? Because they're not listening to you, that's flesh. That is not spirit, right? What about Peter cutting off Malchus's ear? That's not spirit. That's flesh, okay? Look at when the disciples' mother comes to Jesus and says, oh, can my son sit next to you right and left when you're in your kingdom? That's not spirit. That's flesh. So he's constantly correcting them. He's constantly convicting them, as you can be and will be with your parts. So there we are. There's more I could say, as always, but I just wanted to really give you a good view of what it's like to get over this hurdle, right? As soon as you get away from just calling yourself I all the time, instead of saying, well, there's a part of me that, right? Instead of understanding the difference between what you're doing and what your brain is doing, your brain looks at the world very differently to the way your consciousness does, right? Just like the disciples looked at the world a very different way to how Jesus did. Jesus tried to and did help them into the Spirit. But essentially, the way they looked at the world was they were coping as best they can. They were saying, well, we need to deal with the oppression of, the religious leaders. We need to deal with the occupation of the Romans. All of that is something we need to be dealing with. And they were doing the best they could. But anyway, for now, I'll leave it there. And until we get to the next hurdle, bye for now. So I do hope you're getting a lot from this 7 hurdles series and from the channel in general. All the material on this site will always be free, but if you want to support this ministry, then do visit my Patreon channel, which is Building Recovery. I'll put a link to it in the notes, and you'll find different levels there of support. And I want to say thank you again for taking the time to watch these videos.